current state of agriculture is untenable, driven by capital and full of unsustainable inputs which destroy our ecosystems. Unfortunately, exploring alternatives to conventional agriculture is rife with greenwashing, misdirection, agendas driven by greed, and cult of personalities. It's difficult to understand and contextualize the history of agriculture, specifically permanent agriculture, regenerative agriculture, commodity crops, biodynamic farming, organics, and permaculture, not to mention the slew of other ethics involved around growing food. The development of alternative agriculture movements are inevitably influenced by the world the farmers and organizers live within. There are tremendous demands placed on all of us as we try and survive, and success within the system often requires abandoning personal principles. We normally use historical context to help us explain why and how movements grow, failed, or succeeded, but we often fall short of taking the same historical context when looking at our food systems and how they should develop into the future. We all use language to describe the world and arrange our thoughts, and that language changes as cultures shift. Every word has buried within it a myriad of social factors and influences. Social movement-based terminology itself often is echoed into broader conversations, and in this normalization, slowly dilutes itself. When any term becomes popularized or critiqued, such as organic or regenerative when speaking of agriculture, its application becomes less and less meaningful. Instead, they're increasingly defined by how those terms react or exist in relation to their alternatives. For example, if we understood organic practices, how does it influence our understanding of the term regenerative within agriculture? Many view regenerative as something beyond organic, simply by its proximate relationship to organic, right? This unconscious mental model ties regenerative and organic together as linear points along a single axis. These linguistic interassociations can be both useful and damaging. The depth of language around terms adds a foundation which becomes more rigid and less fluid in an evolving world. A term no longer describes a simple idea. It describes a condition which exists in opposition to those other terms. That doesn't mean terminology isn't slippery and difficult to engage with critically, as we see in discussing permaculture, for example, but rather understanding how language operates to help us point to when and how the development and application of new terminology is more appropriate than simply attempting to restructure how a term is applied. So a really easy example of this is something like decolonize X. New words and language allow us to start fresh, which is both a liberatory process for those seeking to fashion a new path forward, but also comes with the added complexity of developing a new language into a greater dialogue. Some practitioners of the alternative agricultural models described above attempt to claim and co-opt agroecology as simply a different word to describe the same thing, or maybe a specific form of that thing that they are already doing. This makes assumptions about agroecology that are incorrect, erases agroecology's history in the global south, and further deny this movement of any of its agency in forging its own path in these dialogues. Over the past few years, the development of the term agroecology has gained steam here in the United States, despite having been a core component of the La Via Campesina, among others, movements across the global south. Agroecology as a word is loaded with different meanings in these places where it's been practiced. As a relatively nascent term, this fluid application of agroecology inevitably means that the application and understanding are understood within the context of what it is not. So in academic settings, for example, it's often in relation to agricultural technology, or, for example, traditional ecological knowledge, or tech. Further, within the context of the Global South, this term is underscored by a very political component, which is intrinsically tied to the active speaker. While many socialist, communist, and anarchist movements will paint this political framework explicitly, the reality is much more nuanced, and something we'll dive into in a moment. This complexity of definition is in itself part of the terminology finding its own space in relation to the movements around it, while absorbing the interests of its biggest advocates. It's because of this complexity and diversity, I felt that it would make more sense to unpack the word agroecology the way we have so far, as well as have this monologue about this subject instead of having a dialogue that could become more complex because of the way questions might arise and interrupt the structure of the bigger piece. While I think it's worth treating agroecology as a relatively modern term given its newness in contemporary agricultural circles, there is a historical context for this term. In fact, there are multiple. Before the term was coined, one of the first folks who spoke about resilient indigenous agricultural strategies was Franklin Hiram King at the beginning of the 20th century. We mentioned him a few episodes back. In the following decades, people interested in sustainable agriculture from a number of different fields came to find the same term, from the Russian Benson, who first used the term agroecology in 1930, to the German ecologist and zoologist Wolfgang Tischler, who published the first book titled Agroecology in 1965. The first major figure to fully describe agroecology in the United States, even if he hadn't used the term specifically, was agronomist Carl Klages in 1928. What initially had started in the early 20th century was understanding agriculture within an ecological context, that it had to follow the same rules as wild, quote unquote, landscapes, and that it evolved alongside other similar disciplines such as the organic movement, the biodynamic movement, the syntropic movement, and the permaculture movement, all of which overlap in some facet or another. However, during the 1980s, writers and researchers were recognizing the inherently interdisciplinary framework of agroecology and the role of other knowledge systems to help understand local agricultural communities. Much like Russell Lord had proclaimed 50 years prior, environmental problems were the byproduct of social problems. But what changed in particular between permaculture and agroecology in the late 70s and early 80s? As disciplines from ecology to sociology, anthropology, and more offered insights into these other knowledge systems, quote unquote, which continued to mature and play prominent roles in alternative agricultural circles, the politics of agroecology became a larger driver in how the movement was viewed. This was in large part because it had gained a foothold in Latin America as hundreds of NGOs and indigenous resistance movements challenged the Green Revolution and its ecological and social consequences. The Green Revolution provided credit access and new technologies to rich farmers, increasingly leaving poor farmers behind with more debt and only occasional success stories. This led those farmers to push for a bottom-up approach, specifically utilizing the resources and indigenous knowledge they already had available. The grassroots participatory aspect of agroecology and its chief concern with the needs of the most marginalized allowed for it to catch fire across the regions. Tech, again, traditional ecological knowledge, is inherently based in agroecology and is also inherently knowledge intensive and hyper localized. What that means is that its practices must be developed on local knowledge and experimentation, making it by definition based in the hands of the people on the ground and incapable of being delivered as a top-down approach. By definition, this framework of agroecology is anti-hierarchical. Interdisciplinary researchers concerned with the impacts of the Green Revolution on these poor communities advocated to develop new approaches for working with traditional farmers who could draw from those endless wells of very specific farming knowledge, and that the path to give those farmers the capacity to live dignified lives must begin with that ancestral knowledge. Agroecology's maturation was at the right place at the right time. The failures of the Green Revolution, as we'd seen with Efraim Hernandez, drove the rise in populist politics, and the emergence of anti-American sentiment in the throes of the Cold War gave agroecology a central place in the resistance movements of peasant and indigenous people. Activist peasant farmers and specialists developed fluid, iterative processes to find ways to develop appropriate technologies that met the needs of the landscape around them. Again, we had talked about this with Russell Lord, the idea of not shying away from technologies, but finding an appropriate application of that technology. The practices they developed and refined worked in conjunction with nature to build a complex system, and this methodology soon became the core of agroecology. The modern left and its influencer base's interpretation of agroecology doesn't consider the specificity and depth of this originating moment. Colonization casts both a shadow on relations with the land and state and scars from physical violence on the landscape and its people that is far more difficult to untangle than a handful of slides on Instagram can portray. In the same vein, the left has liberally translated this rural bloc and its relationship to agroecology, both in alignment and outside of the modern left's interpretation of the movement. Projects like La Via Campesina, which sprung up in the foothills of agroecology, are now framed as being completely leftist movements. For many campesinas, these agroecology-based systems are a matter of self-survival and the only way to remain autonomy. While undoubtedly the agroecological movement is based in rural politics, the politics are less political the way we think of political and more material for those involved. For many, peasant farming isn't an act of resistance, but rather a clinging to what can stand up in the face of shaky national politics and nefarious global actors in regions like Latin America, particularly in the 1980s. That said, the explicit politics of class, and specifically the rural class, are a fundamental piece of how agroecology continued to evolve in tandem with the corresponding repeasantization which took place over the following decades. Now, in the book Agroecology, Science and Politics, the authors Peter Rossett and Miguel Altieri define agroecology as, and quote, the science that studies and attempts to explain the functioning of agroecosystems, primarily concerned with biological, biophysical, ecological, social, cultural, economic, and political mechanisms, functions, relationships, and design, as a set of practices that permit farming in a more sustainable way without using dangerous chemicals, and as a movement that seeks to make farming more ecologically sustainable and more socially just. End quote. This definition is really important. It helps us understand the multifaceted nature of agroecology as both a vision and a method. It also calls our attention to the greenwashing happening in much of its application today, from the United States gagging the FAO, that is, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, from talking about agroecology's politics and trade policy implications and more. We talked a bit about the history of the FAO when talking about Erna Bennett and her role in pushing the FAO to be more ethical. Without a political framework, agroecology cannot address the fundamental systemic exploitation embedded in our existing foodways. While remaining apolitical makes the movement more palatable, and this is something I agree with, which we'll dive into shortly, it doesn't challenge the system as it exists today, but rather provides new tools to make our failing system fail less. A few months after the FAO event, which disallowed any discussion of the politics behind agroecology, a counter-event took place in West Africa to develop a shared vision of agroecology. The organizers sought to build a definition from the movement outside of the power center of the global north, whose language erased the inherent politics of the movement. At this counter-event, the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty presented a vision that was explicitly political and advocated for transforming the world and food systems outside of the industrial food production model. Again, what should be becoming clearer is that defining agroecology, much like other movements, is often best done by defining what they are not. With all that said, it's unsurprising that agroecology's center of gravity is in the global south. Today it is best known as a reflection of indigenous and peasant agriculture. Hey, we're taking a quick break in the episode to remind you that you can get a whole lot more information from poorproles.com. On our website, we have access to our supplemental reader for the podcast, which provides more depth and context as well as thorough citations for all of the stuff we talk about in the show. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which updates you about limited releases, such as various nursery stock that we sometimes sell through the Poor Proles website, as well as updates about new merch that we have. You can also support the show through that website, poorproles.com, where you have access to our Patreon and our Substack to get early releases for articles and episodes. Now, if you enjoy the show and are just looking for even more audio content, go check out Tomorrow Today, which just wrapped up season 1, or tune into the Gastropocene, which is a project of myself and Dr. Aisha Khan to discuss the way our diets have driven the Anthropocene and what it looks like to use our diets for good. Now, back to the show. While I believe this tends to flatten the lived experiences and the complexity of why these regions of the world cling to a smaller scale peasant and campesino farming practice, this is outside of the scope of what we're trying to do here. And hint, it's safer for food to be closely held in places which have been destabilized by outside actors than to build bigger systems of collaboration. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. However, the Global South does provide a lens that we can use to start unpacking what agroecology is, instead of simply pointing to what it is not. The centering of indigenous and peasant campesino practices in these regions highlights the role of ecology in providing the basis for their food systems. By examining this, we have a base point to begin developing our definition of agroecology. From the grains collected in Eastern Europe by Erna Bennett to the corn harvested by Ephraim Hernandez across Central America, the genetic diversity and nuanced, locally adapted food systems offer tools to sustainably and ethically survive a diversity of environments that is otherwise impossible without massive unsustainable inputs, and even then, frequently with failure. Genetically diverse, ecologically aligned food systems have developed across the globe in innumerable ways in a reflection of the vast diversity of the planet. The resilience of naturally diverse communities offer a unique benefit to tackle the challenges of increasingly irregular weather patterns and rapidly changing climate, and leveraging these as food systems offer benefits to which no other agricultural system can compare. These systems have only recently begun to be viewed not as artifacts of time, but rather as promising exemplars for the creativity of humanity to adapt to a diverse set of climates. Whether it be the milpa systems of the Maya or the transhumance Dehesa farmers of the Iberian Peninsula, both of which produced high quantities and qualities of food in what would otherwise be considered inhospitable conditions by conventional agriculture. On top of this, academic interest in tech, again, that is traditional ecological knowledge, has accelerated over the past few decades as well. Tech is a term used to describe the indigenous knowledge systems about soils, plants, and material surplus for creating sustainable human communities in alignment with ecological conditions. These lifestyles are based and reflect the complex and fluid ecological models that exist in their respective communities, reflecting a need to intimately understand the mechanisms at work in these ecologies. Returning to the peasant agriculture image portrayed by academics and NGOs. While tech does often fit the image of the singular farmer in small communities, sun-beaten and aged, this is only a small facet of what is agroecology. While tech offers insight and depth into elegant practices, the aims of agroecology seek to utilize indigenous knowledge systems with modern ecological and agricultural science. In a world of either-or, agroecology provides a third path, much like what Russell Lord was advocating for 100 years ago, seeking to apply the best of all worlds. Integrating the best of each of these systems, including appropriate technologies, we are capable of building efficient, scalable systems which demand less from us in terms of production while maximizing ecological and human benefits. Our goal is not to return or to glorify peasant farming. It is to build the best possible systems for the best possible conditions for people to engage with the world in the ways which they are best suited. Not everyone is meant to farm. So what are the components which become key principles of agroecology? From there, we can unpack how these function and the tools we need to fully and effectively engage with the landscape in an agroecological way. Now, we've made this point already, but agroecology often defines itself as bottom-up learning. We can see that this system is an iterative process that begins with farmer experiences, stewarding land-based and water-based crops, as well as managing a diversity of animal relationship types and collaborative efforts. Over generations, these localized relationships become apparent as species diversify into local ecotypes. This is true for both domesticated and undomesticated human managed species, from maize to honey locusts and pecans and everything in between. Trying to narrow down terms for systems that are inherently unique to specific conditions can be a difficult task. Fortunately, Rasa and Altieri, who I had mentioned before, identify 6 features that are exhibited in most traditional agroecosystems. The first is high levels of biodiversity, which play a key role in regulating ecosystem functioning and also in providing ecosystem services of local and global significance. Number 2 is ingenious landscape, land, and water resource management and conservation systems that are used to improve the efficiency of those agroecosystems. This is something that our friends, the Odom brothers, were quite interested in, but as we went through that episode, we explained some of the shortfalls of their visions. The third one is diversified agricultural systems that provide a broad variety of products to local and national food sovereignty and livelihood security. The fourth is agroecosystems that exhibit resiliency and robustness to cope with disturbance and change, minimizing risk in the face of variability. Number 5 is agroecosystems nurtured by traditional knowledge systems, featuring many farmer innovations and technologies. And lastly, number 6 is strong cultural values and collective forms of social organization, including customary institutions for agroecological management, normative arrangements for resource access and benefit sharing, value systems, rituals, and so on. When we start to unpack these features, we're able to see how each fact is framed on localization, both on localized biodiversity and localized practices. In the process of forging these localizations, the farmers' innovations and technologies are based on, rather than intended to disrupt, the ecology they're based in. For example, improvement in water management in an agroecological context improves local biodiversity while not seeking to fundamentally transform the ecosystem itself. The diverse species in agroecological systems fit into the ecological context, improving regional biodiversity. The goal is not to green the desert, as, say, Jeff Lawton might suggest, but to live in harmony with and nourish the delicate arid landscape. These practices are not simply moralist, but have concrete benefits to farmers and landscapes. Diversity champion strategies include system redundancy by enabling numerous generalist and specialist species to overlap. Redundant systems can withstand greater pressures from factors such as climate change, invasive species, and global biodiversity collapse. Moreover, a single crop failure will not impact the entire function or output of a biodiverse farm. Adapting practices to local site conditions down to very specific microclimates in different areas of a single site creates habitats for ecology while also maximizing the productivity of the system. For example, if inputs are varied between a low nitrogen upland meadow, a wet boggy field, a stream bank, and a fertile bottomland, they can increase the unique biodiversity of each site, reaping the benefits of ecosystem services like pollination and pest control, while avoiding wasting energy fighting a system poorly adapted to a selected practice. What this means is more food, fewer inputs, less effort by the farmer. Fundamentally, the framework of agroecology is imperfectly local and place-based. Community, both human and non-human, collectively work to keep the system healthy and resilient. So to synthesize the mentioned points, we can describe agroecology as a system which supports meaningful above-ground biodiversity, uses diversity to manage pests and diseases, facilitates healthy, diverse soil biomes, and recenters the traditional foodways that are derived from landscapes. While there's an extensive amount of data to unpack about the benefits of intercropping, polycropping, building systems with ecological benefits for pollinators, and so on, I don't think these are areas where people listening to this would need further information on. These systems offer great potential as we learn how we can scale systems and take advantage of their benefits while maximizing our capacity to leverage appropriate technologies. NGOs and other vested parties tend to highlight that 70 to 80% of the world's food is grown by small-scale food producers in plots averaging 2 hectares in size, that there are over 1.5 billion of these smallholders across the globe, and how we view agriculture here in the global north doesn't represent how people relate to food systems across much of the world. This can be insightful, but it can also color the vision of what ethical land stewardship must mean. While collaborative efforts take place on these farms and they exist as part of complex communities, the stewardship of landscapes is irrevocably individualist within a matrix of community in that description. Individuals are interested in managing their individual land with community involvement, but not necessarily in a communal, collaborative, or scalable manner. The question of scalability is often perceived as an inverse relation to both autonomy and anti-hierarchical structures, with centralized polluting commercial agriculture pitted against sustainable family farms. But I think agroecology can point to a third way that doesn't befall these trappings of glorifying unnecessary hard and intensive farming practices. We can recognize what peasant farming provides in the real world while also recognizing that we can and must offer a better alternative. This can be done utilizing appropriate technologies, which can not just free individuals and communities from their small holdings, which in many cases make up more than 50% of the workforce, and even children, but can help further push for greater interdependence across regions, leveraging our collective resources for the greater benefit of all of us, allowing children to study and explore while adults are freed from toil and can find different ways to engage with the human and non-human world, fulfilling their needs as humans. What does it look like to create polycropping systems that can effectively become automated in some capacity? Frustratingly and unsurprisingly, there's no guidebook and few examples. Agroecology is both very specific and, because of that, inherently incapable of being defined on a large scale. It's not prescriptive in the technologies associated with it and will likely not be either. We can still, however, imagine potential mechanisms to apply agroecological thinking to the domain of automation. Much of the flash of the agroecological movement is embedded in data. Improvements to measurable standards of living, biodiversity metrics, yield and profit, and a vague notion of quote-unquote empowering communities, which are all important and valuable clues to what agroecology can offer, and further what's drawn interest from a global audience in comparison to, say, permaculture. Africa's agroecology movement over the past few decades, in response to the Green Revolution, or as we discussed a few episodes back, a Green Revolution for Africa, which has been a rallying point for the movement, pointing to the increased yields by 50 to 100%, improved and varied diets and nutrition for local communities, as well as the obvious long-term benefits of healthier soil, water, and so on. Farmers in these systems claim to have better food security and better health than they ever did with the Green Revolution. Similar to the Latin American model we discussed earlier, African farmers practicing agroecology are typically smallholders who operate on 2 hectares or less. This inevitably operates similarly to homestead-esque projects we are familiar with in the global north, and due to limited resources, typically require community support and solidarity. As global climate change, ecological destruction, forced displacement, and colonial atrocities continue to bear down on these small farmers, they carve out systems of autonomous self-determination through their agricultural practices, which result in improved lives for all in their communities. Within the tug of war that is scalability and individual autonomy, colonization and ecological destruction has afforded individual autonomy some sense of self-control in the face of the overwhelming horror and displacement at the cost of improved lives for all. Now, some researchers argue that when all outputs are fully accounted for, small-scale agroecological projects are just, if not more, efficient than large-scale projects. This is something that we also saw with the Odom brothers. While I do have some doubts on this, the efficiency of small farms cannot be denied in uniquely challenging landscapes where bespoke practices cannot be scaled up or applied elsewhere. But in reality, medium to large-scale systems are comparatively unexplored in an agroecological context. And while massive amounts of investment in tool design and development exist for small-scale farming and homesteading, scalable equipment for medium-sized farming in these types of unique systems is entirely lacking and offers great potential in improving productivity at this scale. Again, this doesn't mean to discount the efforts that have taken place across the globe in the name of agroecology. these achievements are measurable and quite impactful. Rather, we can follow through with agroecology's participatory self-feedback systems of development and improvement to the novel context of global North foodways and improved scalability. Our economic and ecological systems today are driven by petrochemical agriculture focused on annual crops, something that I've coined the term gastropocene to describe. And we can use systems developed in small-scale agroecological models and apply them to novel conditions, transforming our foodways and denying the artificial borders between agriculture and society and ecology. The question we need to ask is, how do we create collective community food systems which don't require that individuals must devote themselves to small plots of land, but rather an integrated system designed for specific ecological regions? While there's no template and there will surely be failures, being willing to risk those failures is our first step in moving away from hyper-individualistic plots, which feeds into the homesteader mentality which permeates much of American and European back to the land type culture. In 1935, in response to the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, Roosevelt's Resettlement Act under the New Deal moved people out of struggling rural and urban areas into small planned communities. The idea was to create a community network of homesteads supported by small industrial downtowns. Ideally, this would create a community of individuals able to produce much of their own food and goods without sacrificing their American hyper-individualism. The fact that these do not exist today speaks to their failures. Now, these communities allotted 40 or more acres to each person in some instances, almost all of which were experienced farmers, only to have communities rapidly fall apart. This insight into American homesteader culture should give pause to this idea of interconnected homestead being a viable model, at least here in the United States, and it points to the complexities of growing food on a small scale in regions that don't have cultural or ancestral knowledge. Conversely, folks today are working to find alternatives for medium to large-scale agricultural products. From the work of Chris Newman at Sylvan Aqua Farms in Virginia, who we interviewed a year back, to Feed the People Farms in Georgia, to Andhra Pradesh's natural farming movement with the women's collectives in India, which we also did an interview a couple years back with. The most successful examples so far have all emerged from the global south, where farmers continue to develop and push the boundaries of what was considered possible. For example, an 1,100-hectare restoration project in Cajamarca, which doubled incomes for farmers through agroecological practices and restorative projects, showcased the benefits of tech in this unique region.
Howdy.
Hello.
Hang on, let me try that again. Hello, skeleton army.
That's aggressive.
Yeah. I'm Angel Luna.
I'm Nash Flynn. Welcome to Death and Friends.
We're two comedians with a podcast.
It's very original of us.
Quiet, you. It is a history tour about everyone's final destination.
As an academic,
Nerd.
I have a PhD. I almost sort of have a PhD. Anyway, I've researched a lot of death history.
And also, I'm here.
We'll talk about ways we die, ways we get buried, and ways we get remembered.
And we even make some friends along the way.
Is it a comedy podcast about death? Or a death history podcast that's funny? We have no idea.
Look, death can be tricky to talk about.
And even though we're talking about it a lot,
just please know, in fact, remember that you are loved, you matter, and if you don't want to be your own friend, we will happily be your friend.
put me in your top 8, baby.
Join us and listen to Death and Friends.
Become a member of the Skeleton Army.
Like right now. Do it.
It's mandatory. Go on. Subscribe. Hit the button.
Yep. You say it. Did
Yep.
you do it? Yes? Okay, good. Okay. Love you.
Love you.
Death and Friends podcast.
Available everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Death?
None of the models that we've talked about so far is an answer for everyone, nor does it even mean that they will be successful on any meaningful scale. Honestly, that's not really the point. Instead, they highlight an emerging answer to the most difficult problem of our era. And that's how can we begin the process of building alternatives to both industrial agriculture as it exists today that is not rooted in self-sufficiency, but rather community ownership, cooperation, and the toleration of the uncomfortable ebb and flow inherent in building any new way of living. An example that highlights these challenges is the organopanicos of Cuba. specifically around integrated crop livestock farming systems. Leveraging these systems allowed for labor needs to drop nearly to half within 3 years of production, allowing each hectare of this system to feed nearly 5 people at the cost of around 800 hours of labor, which is about 6 months of labor. This yield to labor ratio is drastically higher than conventional peasant farming, but it's worth contextualizing this figure. The average American farmer through mechanization can produce an equivalent amount of calories in about 25 hours. For context, that's less than 0.4% of the time to grow the same amount of food. A massive difference which is difficult to even imagine. Of course, there's the obvious qualifier of petrochemical inputs and their corresponding yield improvement. But it's worth considering how an increase in labor 32-fold fundamentally changes our labor relations with agriculture. And that's not accounting for the fact that Cuba has a uniquely advantageous climate for food production in comparison with much of North America. The unique agricultural conditions here in the United States presuppose a wild restructuring of labor resources that would honestly be hard to stomach for most Americans, despite their curated homestead social media feed. The takeaway here is that the future won't have a simple fix, and the solutions we are developing today are by no means complete solutions, but rather what will be archaic remains for future generations, a necessary step along the road to something better. Now, I started this monologue talking about language, the evolution of terminology, and why and when it's appropriate to think about creating and defining new language, and I'm ending it in a similar vein. My own personal vision of agroecology is different than much of the agroecology taking place across the globe. Agroecology, as defined so far, is centered in indigenous knowledge, tech, historical conditions, both for the landscape and the people, social injustices, and bottom-up organizing. All of these are important and valid and necessary. However, in the examples above, the successes of agroecology, much of those successes were framed around crop production and heavily non-native and historically culturally irrelevant crops, such as maize farming, for example, in Africa. There's obviously nothing wrong with growing non-native, non-invasive species for specific purposes, but centering non-native crops in a system predicated on things like tech does seem a bit out of place, and it does ask us to consider how we are defining and relating to tech in the landscape. Further, it's worth considering the complications explored in my criticism of the glorification and fetishization of peasant farming. The histories we value and validate offer insight into ourselves. How do we understand and translate agroecology into a viable system that doesn't trap us within the past? Further, agroecology, as it's been applied in most of the rural global south, has been effective at increasing the quality of life for the poorest communities in the world, but the gap between this standard of living and what we experience in, say, middle-class America is still incredibly wide. The question for us here in the belly of the proverbial beast isn't to critique how agroecology is applied in places that are worlds away from our standards of living, but rather to come to terms with its limitations and to consider what our futures here look like. We have to wonder what places like the United States look like in the face of a world where petrochemical fertilizers will no longer be available at present levels, whether due to the energy inputs to create said chemicals or simply because of the limits of available resources to be mined. There's no shortage of evidence that our ecological systems, at least here in the United States, are quickly unraveling and have been doing so for some time. What do solutions for this actually look like? And how is it shaped by our diets and our lifestyle choices? Now, despite the advocacy by many, if not most, of the regenerative agriculture and whatever other flavor of alternative agriculture movement leaders might say, growing your own food is not the solution to the multiple crises at hand. In fact, in some cases, it is potentially exacerbating the issues that face our soils, our waterways, and our health. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't grow food if you enjoy it, but rather to reframe the idea of what it means to engage with our landscape. Instead of considering reducing our footprint, we should alternatively be considering where we step, how our decisions can align with the landscapes around us using the lens of agroecology. So, for example, growing tomatoes. This can be enjoyable for the right person, but will likely require some kind of inputs, even if not fertilizer, the resources for composting, the fence posts to keep the rabbits away, and all of the other forgotten material expenses which make growing tomatoes possible. We need to recognize the true costs of growing foods and how that changes our relationship with the landscape around us. Growing a tomato plant, biologically speaking, is no more or less significant for the native flora and fauna of my region than growing any varieties of non-native grasses. This means that growing your own food can still be an anthropocentric process which doesn't give back meaningfully to the ecology around you in any way. Moreover, it's a wildly inefficient way to grow food and almost never addresses our needs of staple crops. I mean, who's really growing primarily wheat and corn in their backyard? This is not to say you should not grow tomatoes or produce your own food. Rather, we should be interrogating the quality of our relationship with the land and consider both the costs and benefits of our decisions. The whole idea of homesteading is an isolating process that requires individual despecialization. You need to know a little bit of everything, and redundancy. For example, even in communities of homesteaders, everyone is fundamentally doing the same thing, more or less. The homestead landowners carve up fluid landscapes into privatized parcels with different management practices, each one alienated yet impacted by their neighbors. We could spend extensive amounts of time breaking down the issues of homesteading, and this again isn't to say you should stop doing activities you enjoy, but rather to contextualize homesteading as properties of human alienation and hyper-individuality, and not a revolutionary solution to the problems of modern industrial agriculture. If we seek a better agroecological model than homesteading in the global north, it must combat these structural flaws: the alienation, the disconnection from the land, the unnecessary redundancy, and fundamentally, the anthropocentrism. And I have to ask, what would that look like? Consider, for example, what a farm would look like if the crop selection process began not with farmer preference, but with native ecological conditions. Rather than turning to familiar Eurocentric foodways defined by heterogeneous plants, the farmer would start with what the land needed to express its character. Here in the Northeast, a wetland would direct decisions towards wild rice, tuckahoe, hopness, cattail, black walnut, possibly pawpaw, elderberry, and supplementary sedges which define much of the landscape. The farmer would focus on reducing heavy machinery to avoid soil compaction, use fire and land management, and avoid applying dams to the waterways. Meanwhile, a wooded area might suggest a management style that leans towards savanna conditions, with native masting trees and shrubs surrounded by native grasses and wildflowers. The farmer would use fire to manage these openings and could plant numerous traditional field crops, such as sunflowers, corn, beans, and squash, and polycrop management systems. In all of these cases, the farmer must seek ways to automate these systems to increase productivity and avoid toil without sacrificing the inherent spirit of the land. Prior to industrialization, this was done through landscape-wide practices such as burning, flooding, and grazing, along with shared mechanization like mills. We can learn from these methods by identifying appropriate place-based, labor-saving technologies and organizing our landscape to enable these technologies to be fully leveraged. In a forested area, for example, a community might seek to develop a series of interconnected nut orchards with shared machinery, with trees spaced widely enough for the machinery to access, and seasonal cooperative burns to keep the landscape open. These orchards might allow livestock to graze in the modified form of pastoralism and have hunters cull overpopulated deer and share the meat collectively alongside the produce from the orchards. By starting with landscape and then interrogating how humans can coexist and find a yield in these systems, we can ensure that ecosystem services are preserved and the ecology is protected. Moreover, it helps us reconnect to the non-human world and develop a deep appreciation for the systems we're wrapped within. These systems are inherently diverse and place-based, and they provide resiliency which can withstand the pressures bearing down on us from climate change and ecological degradation. As we regain our footing in our local ecosystem, the question of what future novel ecologies and food systems look like undoubtedly arises. Ultimately, the solutions will have to be pragmatic, but they need to begin with a principled framework that we have to develop beforehand. Intuitively, the idea of scaling up agroecology can seem a bit problematic. How can something without any power structure grow? How does a leaderless movement expand and build bigger projects? The inherently political bent of agroecology makes this harder. How can you quantify the impacts of a system which is framed and dependent on local conditions, both biotic, abiotic, and historical, forcing bottom-up leadership led by farmers to account for the diversity of context? Spread of innovation is, again, not driven by leaders in a movement, but rather horizontal communication, a process termed CAC within the agroecological movement, or campesino a campesino, in which innovations from farmers use popular education to share them, using their own farms as their classrooms. We saw this in the discussion with pecans with grafting to make it popular, and we saw this with the Green Revolution in Mexico. Farmers are far more likely to listen to other farmers rather than agronomists who have no depth of local knowledge and practices. This process empowers farmers and reflects local needs and culture rather than some abstract overarching goal. CAC is a demonstrably effective method to spread agroecological practices outside of Latin America as well as in India. We had spoken about Andhra Pradesh, and they had focused around the concept of zero-budget natural farming. And they did this through self-organizing at local levels without any formal movement or paid staff. ZBNF, as it's called, is a modern interpretation of Rigshire Veda, which we discussed a few years back. And this is an ancient land stewardship method in much of modern India, reflecting cultural values, norms, and historical context while embracing modern scientific evidence. The movement across Andhra Pradesh is arguably the most successful globally, with millions of farmers across India are practicing ZBNF and agroecology, primarily utilizing biostimulants and restoring landscapes that reflect traditional tree crops that had once been prominent on the landscape prior to colonization. Karnataka Rajya Raita Sangha, or KRRS, is a woman-led cooperative model for education, and that's the central piece of the ZBNF success. It shifted dynamics around education and challenging patriarchal structures within communities. In doing this, it drives a community-led process to allow farmers to be open to social pressures to change their practices, including those which perpetuate inequality. Functionally, what we're pointing to here is that communities are the engine of agroecology. Nature doesn't honor property lines, and a bountiful ecosystem provides for its stewards. Communities can identify and adopt practices which foster their sovereignty and well-being, such as land management, financial investments, and resource allocation, pushing even the most resistant farmers to join the larger effort. As the benefits compound into greater and greater results, the community can learn from and celebrate the results together, further refining what works for their local conditions. This also fundamentally means changing values around what food looks like. Specifically, local and regional markets need a marketplace willing to center regionally appropriate products for farmers to grow at profit. This can be done through education, community-supported agricultural schemes, and favorable public policies. Again, we talked about this in the pecan episode, and it gave a great example of what that process might look like in the future. And of course, all of this requires us to have an honest look at the food culture that exists where we live today. Functionally, here in the United States, our food culture is really non-existent. Few regional delicacies exist, and our diet, for me here in New England, has little to differentiate it from most of the United States. If we want to be in tune with the land, we need to be producing and eating foods appropriate to our local conditions, while not ignoring the resources and developments made to improve our capacity to grow food at the same time. Again, the agroecology movement is inherently a social and political movement, because without building political infrastructure, supporting farmers and their new products in an already politically bent market is setting farmers up for failure. The dilemma, of course, with relying on political influence is that farmers engage with politics in a way that forces them to continuously risk their livelihood based on political power, as was experienced in Brazil after the 2016 parliamentary coup d'etat, where many of the policies which allowed co-ops to thrive were reversed, destabilizing many farmers who had relied on them. Now, we keep mentioning the inherently political nature of agroecology, and it's worth exploring this line of thinking outside the continuum of American political thought. Agroecology, as we have said, is inherently political, and yet many institutions working to incorporate the ecological side of agroecology have downplayed that political aspect. The intent of these organizations is to plug into the technical aspects of agroecology without addressing either the cultural or political dynamics of the movement. And we've tossed around this idea of the politics of agroecology, but what truly are the politics of this movement? The reality is that, despite everyone's best efforts, the politics of agroecology cover a wide scope. While prominently anti-capitalism underscores the movement, it's much more specifically anti-colonialism, and the specifics of the movement are simple: a defense of the laboring class of farmers. As I said before, anarchists, communists, and socialists of all stripes tend to paint the anti-capitalist framework of formal institutions backing agroecology as full-throated support for anti-capitalism, but in the process of doing so ignore the dynamics at play. These institutions empower disenfranchised and vulnerable peasant farmers who themselves have living memories of violent displacement and wholesale destruction under colonialism. Food sovereignty and sovereignty for their friends and family in their community take precedence over their alignment with any leftist movement. A cooperative model economy that allowed for private capitalist enterprise would likely be readily more accepted by many in these movements, despite these same people being heralded as proof of a bubbling revolution happening on the periphery of urban spaces. Instead, I would argue that reframing politics within a class framework makes far more sense and reflects the real values of many of the farmers supported and involved with cooperative projects across the global south. And this is from my own personal experiences and conversations. Reframing this dialogue in such a way takes the central movement away from inter-ideological disputes led by hyper-political figures, and instead, it returns the power back to these communities of workers in any fashion they desire, as long as they can claim their individual and collective autonomy. This is a worthwhile lesson here in the United States, and it's one worth considering in a nation where the rural and urban political divide is much more extreme, despite the fact that working class rural folks in the United States often support progressive labor politics, and in some cases even more so than liberal urbanites. This is a topic worth exploring in depth, and one that I won't waste any time here navel-gazing about without the space to do that in-depth exploration. Functionally, what we don't need is more academic bloviating or influencers like myself forcing unrealistic dogma, and what we do want is more on the ground and people willing to work through the discomfort of building trust and finding common ground. The times require us to adopt a non-dogmatic bent, but we also cannot ignore the role of justice in a movement based in ecological sovereignty. Agroecology requires restorative justice for indigenous people and non-humans across the globe who have been forcibly removed from their homes and or their cultural traditions. While contemporary agroecology texts don't address this in significant depth, the answer that emerges is much simpler and more beautiful in many ways. Empowering communities to make their own decisions about what restorative justice looks like. Again, this makes agroecology incompatible with industrial agriculture, as industrial agriculture views the diversity of traits of an ecosystem as issues to be addressed instead of things worth celebrating, despite greenwashing attempts by various governments, agribusinesses, and NGOs. Here in the United States, of course, this is a bit more complicated. With over 99% of their lands lost, indigenous people would face an impossible battle in attempting to restore their prior relationship with Turtle Island. Fights for land back are important and extremely valuable for a number of reasons, and their hard-fought victories are worth celebrating. But it's worth considering what can be done to fit these unique circumstances into a complex and uncomfortable narrative. While it's easy as white people to push for land back and decolonization and pointing to how much of the world's diversity is protected by indigenous communities, this process also erases any responsibility of colonizers and their beneficiaries to solve the problems created by industrial agriculture and indigenous displacement, specifically climate change and ecosystem collapse. Building deep relations with the non-human world around us in the face of colonialism is painful, for both indigenous and non-indigenous people. The more difficult challenge is to assign measurable targets for restorative processes and to figure out what that restorative process looks like for people with access to resources. What does it look like? Now, I'm not going to suggest I have an answer for that, but I do think there are some basics that should help guide what restorative agroecology looks like. The first is to feed working class people affordable, high quality food. Second is improving and incorporating local ecology and traditional land stewardship practices, as well as intentionally engaging with indigenous people who are interested in rekindling or building upon a relationship with the landscape. Third is building community-led, decentralized systems of food production. Fourth is co-creating and sharing knowledge regardless of profit. Fifth is restoring place-based food systems in alignment with market interest. Sixth is recognizing the needs of local ecology, the sovereignty of native species, and their rights to exist in full vibrancy in the lands and waters they call home. Seventh is to work thoughtfully and sit through decisions slowly and collectively. Eighth is consider climate change in your management decisions and make space for non-human climate refugees without sacrificing native ecosystems. And ninth is build accessible systems from the start, soliciting input from interested parties on how to remove barriers and to never impose them to begin with. Food and ecology are for all people and stewarded by all people in different ways. This is by no means comprehensive and is ultimately a guide for my own personal experiences for people to wrestle with on their own. If you're looking for better guidelines, the FAO guidelines, in comparison, are much more vague, leaning on respectability politics and vague notions of ecological justice. What's fundamental to our understanding of agroecology, essentially, is that it is driven by a complex web that isn't just about productivity or abundance, but rather addressing systemic inequities, and not just for humans. Ecology is a complex web that shows a good life simply cannot be made for all people without making a good life for all life. In this way, agroecology is just as slippery as other alternatives to industrial agriculture. However, the underpinnings are based on equity for all, not just those with access. It's for this reason that agroecology offers a path forward in the face of ecological destruction, colonialism, and a rotting economic system. It has to, and we have to make it.